Dear viewers, this powerful story will teach you about breaking cycles of abuse, the danger of community silence, and why we must never ignore someone suffering. You'll learn about true courage, the healing power of respect, and how one person's action can change everything. After watching, share your thoughts in the comments about what you would do if you witnessed abuse in your community. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories that deliver real-life wisdom and hope. Your support means everything. The wooden rod came down across Amara's shoulders with a crack that echoed through the compound. She bit her lip hard, refusing to give her stepmother the satisfaction of hearing her scream this early in the beating. It was only the third strike. There would be at least 20 more. You lazy, worthless girl. Mrs. Okonkwo's voice was shrill with rage. I sent you to fetch water 2 hours ago. 2 hours. What were you doing? Meeting some boy like a prostitute. Amara wanted to explain that the well had been crowded, that she'd had to wait her turn behind 15 other women and girls, that carrying the heavy clay pots the 3 kilometers back had taken time. But explanations only made the beatings worse. Mrs. Okonkwo didn't want reasons. She wanted an outlet for her bitterness, and Amara was convenient. The rod struck again, this time across her back, then her arms as she instinctively raised them to protect her face. Through the window, Amara could see Mrs. Adeyemi next door pause in her sweeping, hear the beating, then deliberately turn and walk back into her house. The window shutters closed with a decisive click. It was always the same. The neighbors heard. The neighbors knew. The neighbors did nothing. Mama, can I have the stick when you're done? Amara's half-brother Chitty called from the veranda, where he lounged with Assistant Ngozi, both of them watching the beating like it was entertainment. I want to see if I can make her jump higher. They laughed. They were 15 and 17, Mrs. Okonkwo's biological children, and they had learned cruelty from an expert teacher. Amara was 19, but she might as well have been 9 for all the agency she had in this house. When her father died 3 years ago, everything had changed overnight. The man who protected her, who'd called her his precious jewel, who'd promised she'd go to secondary school and maybe even university, he was gone. And with him went any semblance of family. Mrs. Okonkwo, her father's second wife, had wasted no time. Within weeks of the burial, Amara's room had been given to Ngozi. Her father's savings, which he set aside for her education, mysteriously disappeared into funeral expenses. The small plot of land he designated as her inheritance was suddenly needed to expand Mrs. Okonkwo's trading business, and Amara became what she'd always secretly been in Mrs. Okonkwo's eyes, a servant. She woke before dawn to light the cooking fire. She fetched water from the distant well, sometimes making the journey 4 or 5 times a day. She washed everyone's clothes by hand at the stream. She cooked every meal, scrubbed every pot, swept every floor. She worked the family farm plot, planting and weeding and harvesting under the brutal sun. And for all this labor, she received a thin mat in the storage room, 2 meals a day of whatever leftovers a family didn't want, and beatings for any perceived infraction. Too slow? Beating. Too fast and therefore rushing carelessly? Beating. Food too salty? Beating. Not salty enough? Beating. Looking disrespectful? Beating. Not making eye contact and therefore being sullen? Beating. The rod finally stopped. Amara's shoulders back, and arms throbbed with fresh pain that would layer over yesterday's bruises and last week's scars. She'd learned to catalog her injuries by age, the purple-black fresh ones, the greenish-yellow week-old ones, the faded brown ones from months ago that never quite disappeared. Get out of my sight, Mrs. Okonkwo spat. And tomorrow, if you're not back from the well in exactly 1 hour, I'll use the belt instead of the stick. Do you hear me? Yes, Ma, Amara whispered. She limped toward the storage room, her sanctuary and her prison. On the way, she passed a family room where her father's photo hung on the wall. She couldn't look at it anymore. It hurt too much to remember when she'd been loved. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Okonkwo sent her to market to buy ingredients for dinner. Amara welcomed these errands despite the pain in her shoulders. The market meant a brief escape, a chance to see other faces, to remember there was a world beyond the compound walls. She moved through the stalls slowly, her small purse clutched tight. Mrs. Okonkwo counted every kobo, and if Amara returned with incorrect change, there would be consequences. At the vegetable stand, she stopped to examine tomatoes. The seller, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, saw her wince as she reached for a basket. "Are you all right, child?" the woman asked softly. Amara forced a smile. "Yes, Ma. Just tired from work." The woman's eyes drifted to the edge of Amara's sleeve, where a bruise peeked out. Her expression shifted. Recognition, pity, and then the thing Amara hated most, calculated indifference. The woman knew, but knowing and acting were different things. 300 naira for the tomatoes, the woman said, her tone now brisk and businesslike. As Amara counted out the coins, she felt eyes on her. She looked up and met the gaze of a man at the neighboring vegetable stand, not a customer, but the farmer who sold there sometimes. He was perhaps in his early 30s, tall and lean from physical labor, with quiet, observant eyes. Tobenna. She knew his name because people talked about him, usually with a mix of respect and confusion. The quiet one, they called him. Strange fellow. Barely says 2 words. Lives alone on that farm. Never married. Keeps to himself. He was watching her now with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Not the leering way some men looked at young women, but something else. Something that felt like assessment. She gathered her purchases quickly and turned to leave, but as she passed the stand, he did something unexpected. He reached out, not to grab her, but to place 3 extra tomatoes in her basket. "For free," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, rusty from disuse. I can't. My stepmother counts everything. If I have extra, she'll think I stole. Tell her they were overripe. The seller gave them free rather than throw away." He was already turning back to arrange his vegetables, the conversation apparently over. Amara hesitated, then nodded her thanks and hurried away, her heart inexplicably lighter from this small kindness. She shouldn't have felt hopeful. She should have known better. When she arrived home, Mrs. Okonkwo was waiting at the gate, arms crossed. Her eyes went immediately to the basket, counting, assessing. "Why do you have so many tomatoes?" Amara's mouth went dry. The seller said they were overripe, Ma. She gave them free rather than... Liar. The slap came so fast Amara didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut her inner cheek. "You think I'm stupid? You stole them. Or worse, you got them from some man. What did you do for those tomatoes, you prostitute?" "No, Ma. I swear," the seller. But Mrs. Okonkwo wasn't listening. She never listened. She grabbed Amara's arm, nails digging into already bruised flesh, and dragged her toward the compound, toward the rod that leaned against the wall, toward another beating. Amara's hopes, briefly lifted by a quiet farmer's small kindness, came crashing back down into the familiar darkness of her daily reality. And across the road, unnoticed in the dying light of evening, Tobenna stood at his usual spot, watching, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. For the first time in 3 years of witnessing this girl's suffering, he did not walk away. He did not close his window. He did not mind his own business. He stood and watched, and something in his quiet eyes promised that watching would not be all he did. Tobenna knew people thought he was strange. He'd heard the whispers his entire adult life. Too quiet. Keeps to himself. Never married. Something odd about him. They weren't entirely wrong. He was quiet. He did keep to himself. But there were reasons, and those reasons had names and faces and scars that no one could see. His uncle's face, twisted with alcohol-fueled rage. His aunt's deliberate deafness to a young boy's cries. The neighbors who heard and knew and did nothing. Tobenna had learned at age 8 that screaming for help was pointless when everyone had already decided your suffering was not their problem. He'd learned at 12 that survival sometimes meant silence, going still and quiet, so the monster would lose interest faster. He'd learned at 16 that the only way to escape was to save yourself, because no one was coming. So he'd left, worked other people's farms, saved every kobo. bought his own land at the edge of the village, built a small house with his own hands, planted crops, raised chickens, created a life where no one could hurt him because he let no one close enough to try. For 15 years, the strategy had worked. And then he'd seen the girl at the market. It had been months ago, maybe 8 or 9. She'd been buying yams, counting out coins with shaking hands, while a large bruise bloomed purple across her forearm. When the yam seller commented on it, the girl had smiled, a terrible practice smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said she'd fallen. Tobenna had known that smile. He'd worn it himself once. He'd started noticing her after that, not in a romantic way. She was young enough to be his younger sister, but in the way a soldier recognizes another soldier, the way a survivor recognizes someone still trapped in the war he'd escaped. The pattern became clear quickly. She came to market often, always with bruises she tried to hide, always with that practiced smile and ready excuses, always with eyes that looked simultaneously hopeful for kindness and terrified of attention. He'd learned her name by listening, Amara, learned her situation, the stepmother who'd taken everything after her father died, learned the village's complicity. Everyone knew, no one acted. And Tobenna had felt something he hadn't felt in years, anger hot enough to burn through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. So he'd started walking past the Okonkwo compound in the evenings. Not every day at first, but often enough to establish a pattern. He'd noticed that the beatings typically happened around 6 o'clock, when the day's work was evaluated and punishments were doled out. The first time he'd stopped and simply stood at the gate, watching through the open compound as Mrs. Okonkwo struck Amara with a rod. The woman had noticed him. "What are you looking at?" she'd shrieked. "Is this your house? Mind your business and move on." Tobenna had said nothing. He'd simply stood there, his eyes moving from the woman to the girl to the rod, and back again, his face expressionless, but his presence loud in its refusal to look away. Mrs. Okonkwo had faltered. Only for a moment, but she'd faltered. Then she dragged Amara inside, away from his witnessing eyes. Good, Tobenna had thought. Feel uncomfortable. Feel watched. Feel what she feels every day. He'd made it a routine after that. Every evening at 6, his walk took him past the Okonkwo house. Sometimes he saw beatings. Sometimes he only heard them. But always he stopped. Always he watched if he could see. Always, he stayed until the crying stopped. Mrs. Okonkwo became paranoid. He'd heard her raging about that strange farmer, and why does he keep walking here, and is he a thief checking our house? But she'd never confronted him directly again, and he'd noticed the beatings had started happening more inside the house, away from his line of sight. He'd also started leaving vegetables at their gate in the early morning, before anyone was awake. Fresh tomatoes, okra, peppers, things from his farm that cost him only labor. He never announced himself, just left them and walked away. He'd known Mrs. Okonkwo thought they were from church members or admirers. She'd taken them without question, never suspecting the strange, quiet farmer was capable of such gestures. But Amara had known. He'd seen recognition in her eyes the next time he saw her at market. She hadn't said anything. What could she say that wouldn't get her in trouble? But she'd looked at him differently, not with fear or pity, but with something like understanding, maybe even gratitude. Still, he'd never spoken to her, never directly intervened. He'd told himself he was doing what he could without making things worse, that his presence was enough to at least modify the worst of the abuse. He'd been lying to himself, and he'd known it the evening Amara hadn't come home. He'd been walking past the compound at his usual time when he'd heard Mrs. Okonkwo's voice, shrill and carrying. "Where's that stupid girl? She should have been back from the forest an hour ago. When she gets back, I'll teach her about being late." The forest. Alone. After dark. Tobenna hadn't thought. He'd simply gone. The forest path was one he knew well. He collected wild mushrooms and medicinal plants there sometimes. But darkness was falling fast, and the forest at night was dangerous. Wild animals. Deep gullies hidden by vegetation. Easy to get hurt. Easy to get lost. He'd found her at the bottom of a slope, her ankles swollen, tears streaming down her face, trying and failing to climb back up. "Please," she'd whispered when she'd seen him, her voice broken with pain and fear. "Please help me. I have to get back. If I'm too late, she'll... Tobenna had descended the slope without a word, without asking permission. He'd lifted her onto his back, her weight slight from years of inadequate food, and carried her up and out. But he hadn't taken her home. He'd taken her to his small farmhouse, sat her on his single chair, cleaned the mud and blood from her ankle with water warmed on his cooking fire, torn strips from one of his own shirts to bandage the swelling. And then, for the first time in months of watching and walking and leaving anonymous vegetables, he'd spoken to her. "You don't have to go back there." She'd stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. He continued, his words careful and deliberate as they always were when he chose to speak. "You can stay here, in this house. I will not touch you. I will not hurt you. But you will be safe and fed, and no one will beat you. You don't understand," she'd whispered. "She'll look for me. She'll say I stole something. She'll make the village find me. And when they do, then let them find you here. And I will tell them you stole nothing, that you came of your own will, that you are under my protection." "Why?" The word had burst from her like a sob. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. I have nothing to give you. No money, no." "I know what it's like," he'd said simply, "to scream and have no one listen, to hurt and have everyone pretend they don't see. I know what it's like to wait for rescue that never comes." He'd paused, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "I swore that if I ever had the chance to be what I needed and never found, I would take it. You are that chance." She'd wept then, deep, shaking sobs of someone finally safe enough to fall apart. And Tobenna had sat across from her, not touching, not speaking, just present, just witnessing her pain the way he'd witnessed her suffering for months, just refusing to look away. Eventually, she'd calm enough to speak. "I'm afraid," she'd admitted. "Not of you. Of everything else. Of what happens when I go back. Of what she'll do." "Then don't go back tonight," he'd said. "Stay here. Rest. Heal your ankle. Decide in the morning if you want to return or if you want to stay. The choice is yours. But whatever you choose, know that this door is open to you." She'd stayed that night, slept in his bed while he'd slept on a mat on the floor. And in the morning, she'd chosen to go back. He'd said nothing about that choice, just walked her to the edge of his property and watched her limp toward the house that hurt her. But they'd both known that something had shifted. The next evening, when he walked past the Okonkwo compound and heard the sound of the worst beating yet, heard Amara's screams echo through the village while windows closed and people turned away, he'd stopped at the gate. And this time, he'd pushed it open, walked into the compound, and stood in the courtyard, 10 feet from where Mrs. Okonkwo stood, with belt raised over a cowering Amara. "Get out of my compound." Mrs. Okonkwo had shrieked. Tobenna had said nothing, just looked at Amara, at her face swollen with tears and pain, and made a promise with his eyes that she somehow understood. This time, help was coming. This time, someone was listening. This time, she wouldn't suffer alone. Tobenna knew what it felt like to be ignored, so he refused to ignore Amara's suffering. He didn't just watch, he acted. Have you ever been a person who acted when everyone else stayed silent? Or do you wish someone had acted for you? Share your story in the comments. Your words might help someone else feel less alone. If Tobenna's quiet courage is inspiring you, smash that like button and subscribe to African Tales by Zion for more stories about real heroes. Next chapter shows what happens when Amara finally chooses freedom. You don't want to miss it. Amara woke on her thin mat in the storage room, her body a map of agony. The belt had been worse than the rod. It had wrapped around her ribs, her back, her legs. Every breath hurt. Every movement was torture. But worse than the physical pain was the certainty that had crystallized in the darkness of night. If she stayed, she would die. Maybe not today. Maybe not next month. But eventually one of these beatings would go too far. One blow would land wrong. One punishment would cross the line from abuse to murder. And everyone would say what they always said, it was an accident. She should have been more obedient. These things happen in families. No one would call it what it was. No one would hold Mrs. Okonkwo accountable. No one except, perhaps, a quiet farmer who'd offered her the impossible. A door that stayed open. A choice she'd never had. Freedom. At dawn, while the household still slept, Amara made her decision. She owned nothing that couldn't be carried on her body. The clothes she wore had been her father's money. But Mrs. Okonkwo would say they were stolen if Amara left in them. But what choice did she have? Leave naked? She crept through the silent house like a ghost, her heart pounding so loud she was certain it would wake everyone. Past Chitty's room where he snored. Past Ngozi's door where she'd once had her own room. Past the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals she'd barely been allowed to eat. Past her father's photo. And this time she did look at it. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered. "I tried to stay. I try to honor you by staying in our family home. But this isn't family, and I can't stay anymore." The front door was never locked. Why would it be? Mrs. Okonkwo never imagined her obedient, broken servant would have the audacity to escape. The morning air was cool and clean. The village was silent except for early roosters and distant dogs. Amara's ankle still throbbed from her fall, and every step was painful. But pain had become such a constant companion that she barely noticed it anymore. 3 kilometers. That's how far Tobenna's farm was. She'd walked it yesterday in the opposite direction. She could walk it again. She walked. Every step was an act of rebellion. Every meter distance was a layer of fear peeling away. By the time she saw his small house in the distance, dawn was breaking in earnest, painting the sky pink and gold. Tobenna was already awake, working his field. He saw her coming from far away and straightened, watching her approach. When she finally stood before him, dusty and limping and terrified but free, he simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting her, as if he'd known she'd come. "I left," she said unnecessarily. I can't go back. If you meant what you said, if the offer is still—" "It is," he said simply. "Come. You need water and food and rest." He led her to his house, showed her to a small room, clean, with a real bed and actual sheets. "This is yours," he said, "for as long as you need it, or want it. The door locks from the inside if you wish. You're safe here." Amara nodded, unable to speak past a lump in her throat. When he left and closed the door, she locked it, not because she feared him, but because she needed to feel what it was like to control a door, to be able to keep the world out if she chose. She lay on the bed, a real bed, soft and clean, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without fear. Meanwhile, back at the Okonkwo house, Mrs. Okonkwo woke to find Amara gone. Her first emotion wasn't worry or concern. It was rage. "That ungrateful would just run away," she shouted, waking the entire household. "After everything I did for her, fed her, clothed her, gave her a roof." Chitty and Ngozi, comfortable in their beds bought with their father's money that should have been Amara's, nodded along with their mother's victimhood. "We should report her to the chief," Ngozi suggested. "She probably stole something before she left." Mrs. Okonkwo's eyes lit up. Yes, she stole money. From my secret savings. I'm sure of it. She had no such savings. But lies were easy when everyone was predisposed to believe the worst about a runaway girl. She marched to the chief's compound, her children in tow, ready to perform her greatest act yet. The wrong guardian who'd been betrayed by the ungrateful child she'd so generously cared for. The chief listened to her story with appropriate concern. "This is serious," he agreed. "Theft cannot be tolerated. We will form a search party." But as word spread to the village, people's reactions were complicated. "I'm sure she stole," one man said. "Why else would she run?" But an old woman muttered, "I'm sure she had reasons." We all heard that child scream every night. "It's not our place to judge how a woman disciplines her household," a trader argued. "Discipline?" Another woman snorted. "You call beating a girl bloody discipline?" The village was dividing along predictable lines. Those who valued order and traditional family values versus those whose consciences had been bothering them for 3 years. The search party formed, but most men walked slowly, checked obvious places half-heartedly. Some, it seemed, hoped Amara would not be found. By midday, Tobenna heard about the search and the accusations. He'd expected this. Mrs. Okonkwo was predictable in her venality. He did something he almost never did. He walked to the chief's compound, a place of politics and loud men, and everything he usually avoided. The chief's courtyard was crowded with the search party, reporting their lack of success. Mrs. Okonkwo was working herself into a righteous fury about the thief who'd stolen her money and must be found and punished. Tobenna walked into the compound, and conversation stopped. People stared. The quiet farmer, who never involved himself in village affairs, was here. "Chief," Tobenna said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "Amara is at my farm." Gasps. Mrs. Okonkwo's face went purple with rage. You've been hiding her. You're probably the one who helped her steal. You're probably lovers. You perverted old man, corrupting a young girl." "She stole nothing," Tobenna said, his voice cutting through her hysteria with calm certainty. "She arrived at dawn with nothing but the clothes she wore. She came of her own will. She will stay of her own will. She's my responsibility." Mrs. Okonkwo shrieked. "Her father left her in my care. She belongs to me." "Her father is dead," Tobenna said, meeting the chief's eyes directly. "She is 19 years old. She belongs to herself, and she has chosen not to return to your house." "But the theft," the chief started. "There is no theft. Search my house if you wish. Question her yourself. You'll find no stolen goods. Only a girl with scars on her body from years of beatings that this entire village heard and ignored." Silence fell. Uncomfortable, guilty silence. The chief shifted in his seat. "These are serious accusations. Tobenna, both ways. If Mrs. Okonkwo says Amara stole, we must investigate. But if you claim abuse, these are family matters that are complicated." "They're not complicated," Tobenna said. "They're just uncomfortable. It's easier to ignore a girl's screams than to hold a respectable woman accountable. But ease and justice are not the same thing." Mrs. Okonkwo saw she was losing ground. She changed tactics, as he'd known she would. "Even if she didn't steal, which I'm sure she did, she cannot live alone with a man. I'm married. It's shameful. What will people say? She's a woman. She needs proper supervision." The chief nodded slowly. This was easier ground for him. Propriety and tradition rather than justice and accountability. "The woman raises a point," he said. "It is irregular for an unmarried girl to live in a man's house. People will talk." "Then I will marry her," Tobenna said. The courtyard erupted. Mrs. Okonkwo's screech of outrage mixed with gasps of shock and excited murmurs. Tobenna raised his voice slightly, still not yelling, but loud enough to be heard over the noise. "If marriage is what makes you leave her in peace, I offer it. If marriage is what protects her from being dragged back to abuse, I offer it. If the only thing standing between her and safety is propriety, then I will provide propriety." He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at the chief. "Amara will come tomorrow to speak for herself. She will tell you what she wants. She will show you what she has endured. And then you will decide if you're the kind of chief who values a powerful woman's pride over a powerless girl's life. I hope you choose wisely." He walked away, leaving chaos in his wake, and didn't look back. The village square had not been this crowded since the chief's own daughter's wedding 2 years ago. But this gathering was very different. This was spectacle and judgment, and the kind of drama that would be discussed for months. Amara stood in the center, fighting to keep her hands from shaking. Every eye was on her, and she could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their barely concealed excitement at the scandal. Tobenna stood beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his steadiness. He'd asked her that morning, privately, "Are you sure you want to do this? It won't be easy. They'll ask invasive questions. They'll look at your scars. They'll judge you for leaving." "I know," she'd said, "but I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being ashamed of what was done to me. If telling the truth is what it takes to be free, then I'll tell it." So here she was, about to do the hardest thing she'd ever done, speak her truth in public. Mrs. Okonkwo arrived dressed in her finest wrapper and blouse, gold jewelry gleaming. her face arranged in perfect wounded dignity. She knew how to play this crowd. She'd been doing it for years. "Chief," she began, her voice trembling with calculated emotion, "thank you for seeing justice in this matter. This ungrateful girl has brought shame on my household. After everything I sacrificed for her, after I welcomed her into my home, fed her from my own table, treated her like my own daughter." Murmurs of sympathy from some of the crowd. Mrs. Okonkwo was, after all, a respected trader with money and influence. And now she runs away and brings accusations against me to cover her own theft and shameful behavior. Living with a man, unmarried. What kind of girl does such things? More murmurs, these less sympathetic. The crowd was divided, uncertain. The chief raised his hand for silence. "We are here to establish facts. First, the matter of theft. Mrs. Okonkwo, you claim Amara stole money from you. What evidence do you have of this? She knew where I kept my savings. And now they're gone. Show us this hiding place. Show us evidence that money was there and now is not." Mrs. Okonkwo faltered. "It was hidden. I can't just. That would reveal where I keep my money to everyone." "Then how can we confirm it existed?" the chief asked reasonably. "Are you calling me a liar?" Mrs. Okonkwo's voice rose with indignation. "I'm asking for proof of a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" She didn't. They all knew she didn't. The theft accusation was crumbling, and Mrs. Okonkwo could see it. The chief turned to Amara. "Child, did you steal from Mrs. Okonkwo?" Amara's voice was quiet but clear. "No, sir. I took nothing from that house except the clothes I wore. She can search Tobenna's entire farm if she wishes. She'll find no money, no jewelry, nothing that belongs to her." "Then that matter is settled," the chief said. "There is no evidence of theft. However, there remains a question of your departure and your current living situation. Why did you leave your father's house? This is a serious thing for a girl to leave her family." This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for. Amara took a breath and began to speak. "I left because if I had stayed, I would have died." The crowd stirred. "For 3 years since my father's death, I have been beaten almost daily, with rods, with belts, with cooking spoons, for being too slow, for being too fast, for burning food, for not burning food, for looking wrong, for breathing wrong, for existing in a house where I was not wanted but was useful." Mrs. Okonkwo's face was turning red. "She lies. I disciplined her when necessary as any guardian. I have scars," Amara said, her voice growing stronger. "I can show them. I will show them, if the chief permits it." The chief looked uncomfortable, but nodded. This was evidence that couldn't be ignored. Amara turned around and, with shaking hands, lifted her blouse to show her back. The crowd gasped. Even people who'd suspected the abuse hadn't imagined the extent. Her back was a roadmap of violence, old scars layering over older ones, some faded to white, others still purple-brown. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, years of pain mapped onto skin. She lowered her blouse and turned back around. "My arms." She rolled up her sleeves, showing similar scarring. "My legs." She lifted her wrapper slightly, showing marks from ankle to thigh. "This is not discipline," she said, her voice cracking but not breaking. "This is torture. This is hatred. This is what happened to me every day in the house my father left me, in what should have been my home but became my prison." Mrs. Okonkwo was sputtering. "She's exaggerating. These could be from anything. She's clumsy. I have seen the beatings," Tobenna said quietly, but his voice carried. "I have walked past that house many times. I have heard the screams. I have seen this woman strike this girl." He turned to face the crowd directly. "We all heard. We all knew. We all did nothing." An uncomfortable silence fell. Then, slowly, an elderly woman stepped forward. Her name was Mama Nkechi, and she lived 3 houses down from the Okonkwos. "It's true," she said, her voice heavy with shame. "We all heard, almost every evening, that poor child screaming, and we closed our windows. We told ourselves it wasn't our business, that family matters should stay in the family, that we shouldn't interfere. Another person spoke up, Mr. Ease, a trader who'd known Amara's father. I knew the girl's father. Good man. He would be devastated to see what became of his daughter in that house. We all knew, and we all did nothing. Shame on us. More voices joined. Not everyone. Some still muttered about respect for elders and traditional discipline, but enough to shift the atmosphere from judgment of Amara to something else. Collective guilt. Mrs. Okonkwo saw the tide turning against her and tried once more. Even if I was strict, which I had to be, the girl was lazy. She's still a woman, living with a man, unmarried. This is shameful. She needs to be under proper supervision. She needs to be safe, Tobenna said. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. And if the only way to ensure her safety is marriage, then I offered again, publicly. Amara, you don't have to accept. But if you want protection that even this village's respect for tradition cannot penetrate, I offer you my name and my home and my promise that no one will touch you in anger ever again. All eyes turned to Amara. She looked at Tobenna, this quiet man who'd watched when others ignored, who'd acted when others stayed silent, who'd offered her freedom without demanding anything in return. She didn't love him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she respected him. She trusted him. And she knew, deep in her bones, that he meant every word of his promise. I accept, she said clearly. I will marry Tobenna, of my own free will, because I choose safety over slavery, because I choose life over slow death, because I choose a man who has shown me more kindness in silence than my family ever showed me with words. She turned to Mrs. Okonkwo, and for the first time in 3 years, she met the woman's eyes without fear. I forgive you, Amara said quietly, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry hatred for you into my new life. But I will never forget what you did, and I will never, ever return to that house. The chief, seeing a solution that would satisfy tradition and allow him to avoid directly accusing a respected woman of abuse, seized the opportunity. If Tobenna marries her, she becomes his responsibility before this community. The matter is settled. He looked at Mrs. Okonkwo. Do you have any legal objection to this union? Mrs. Okonkwo wanted to object, but objecting would mean admitting she wanted Amara back for reasons that couldn't be spoken aloud. Free labor, someone to abuse, someone to blame. Fine, she spat. Let him have the ungrateful wretch. He'll soon see what a burden she is. She swept away, her dignity in tatters, her power over Amara finally broken. The crowd began to disperse, some still murmuring about propriety, others about the abuse they'd all ignored, everyone processing a drama that had become uncomfortably revealing about themselves. Tobenna turned to Amara. Are you sure about this? Marriage is permanent. You can still change your mind. I'm sure, Amara said, not because I have to be, but because I want to be. Thank you, Tobenna, for seeing me, for not looking away. Thank you, he replied quietly, for choosing to save yourself. I just kept the door open. You're the one who walked through it. Wow! The entire village just got called out for their silence. Tobenna exposed everyone who heard Amara scream, and did nothing. And Amara just showed her scars publicly and forgave her abuser. That takes massive strength. What did you think of her choice to forgive Mrs. Okonkwo? Was it too soon? Or is forgiveness about freeing yourself, not excusing them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this chapter moved you, smash that like button and subscribe to African Tales by Zion. One more chapter left. Chapter 5 shows Amara's transformation from victim to survivor to victor. You absolutely cannot miss how this story ends. The wedding was simple. So simple that Mrs. Okonkwo would have sneered at it as beneath dignity had she attended, which she had not. Just a chief, 2 witnesses from the village, an exchange of vows under the old baobab tree at the edge of Tobenna's property. Amara wore a borrowed wrapper from Mama Nkechi, who'd offer it with tearful apologies for her years of silence. Tobenna wore his one good shirt. The vows were traditional. The ceremony was quick, and when it was done, Amara was no longer just a girl who'd escaped abuse. She was a married woman with the legal and social protection that status afforded. But more importantly, she was free. "You can have time," Tobenna told her that evening as they sat outside his small house, now their house. "To adjust, to heal. I meant what I said. This marriage can be whatever you need it to be." "What do you need it to be?" Amara asked, curious about this man who'd upended his quiet life for her sake. Tobenna was silent for a long moment, gathering words the way he always did. Carefully, deliberately. "I need it to be honest," he finally said. "I don't expect love. Maybe it will come someday. Maybe it won't. But I need honesty. If you're unhappy, tell me. If you need something, tell me. If I do something that frightens you, tell me. I can't read minds, but I can listen." "I can do that," Amara said. "Honesty. I've lived with lies for 3 years. It would be good to live with truth instead." They sat in comfortable silence, and Amara marveled at this. That silence could be comfortable, that she could sit beside a man without flinching, that her shoulders could relax without fear of a blow from behind. The days that followed established new patterns. Tobenna woke early and worked his fields. Amara rose when she woke naturally. No one screaming at her, no beatings for laziness. She cooked breakfast for both of them, but it wasn't forced labor. It was partnership. "You don't have to do this," Tobenna said the first morning, seeing her at his cooking fire. "I can cook for myself." "I know," Amara said, "but I like to cook. I just don't like being forced to cook. There's a difference." He nodded, understanding that difference perfectly. She began helping on the farm. Not because she had to, but because sitting idle made her anxious. 3 years of constant labor had programmed her to feel guilty for rest. But working Tobenna's fields was different from working Mrs. Okonkwo's. Here, when she finished a row of planting, Tobenna would thank her. When she carried water to the seedlings, he'd offer to help. When the sun got too hot, he'd insist she rest in shade. "You're a partner," he explained simply, "not a servant. I don't want you working yourself sick. We do what needs doing, and we rest when we need rest." Weeks became months. Amara's body healed. The bruises faded. Her weight increased with regular meals. The constant tension in her shoulders eased. Her spirit took longer, but it too began to mend. Tobenna taught her things. How to read the sky for rain, which plants were good for medicine, how to properly care for chickens so they laid better eggs. And one evening, he brought out an old, battered book. "Can you read?" he asked carefully, not wanting to assume or offend. "A little," Amara admitted. "I finished primary school before my father died, but not much since then. Would you like to learn more?" Her eyes had lit up, the first real joy he'd seen in her face. "Yes, yes, please." So he taught her. Every evening after dinner, they would sit together, and he would help her sound out words, explain meanings, open worlds she thought lost her forever. "How did you learn?" she asked one night. "You said you left your uncle's house at 16. How did you have time for education?" Tobenna had hesitated, then told her his story, about his uncle's fists and his aunt's indifference, about the villagers who'd heard his cries and closed their doors, about his escape and the years of wandering and working and saving. "I learned from anyone who would teach me," he said. "A farmer who let me work his land in exchange for reading lessons. A trader who taught me numbers so I could help with his accounts. A pastor who let me attend school with the children for a year when I was 17, even though I was already tall and bearded and looked ridiculous sitting with small children." He paused, his voice going soft. "I learned because I swore that if I ever had the chance to build a better life, I would take it. Education was the tool I needed, so I found it however I could." Amara had reached out then, the first time she voluntarily touched him and placed her hand over his. "Thank you," she'd said, "for understanding, for seeing me and remembering yourself, for not becoming like the people who hurt you." "Thank you," he'd replied, "for trusting me when you had every reason not to trust anyone." Months turned into a year. The marriage of convenience became something else, not passionate romance, but deep affection, respect, partnership, the kind of quiet love that built slowly, brick by brick, day by day. Amara started a small garden of her own, growing vegetables to sell at market. Tobenna helped her build raised beds and showed her which crops grew best in which seasons. With the money she earned, she bought her first possession as a free woman, a notebook and pencils. "What will you write?" Tobenna asked. "My story," she said, "so I never forget where I came from. And so maybe someday someone else who's suffering will read it and know they can escape too." She did more than write. She began visiting the village, particularly on market days, and she began to notice things she'd once been too beaten down to see. Other girls with bruises they tried to hide, other women with eyes that looked dead, other children who flinched at Ray's voices. "We should do something," she told Tobenna one evening. "We?" he asked, not disagreeing, just curious. "People are still suffering, still being hurt, and everyone is still pretending not to see, just like they did with me. What did you have in mind?" "I want to speak," she said, "at the village gathering. I want to tell my story again. But this time, not to defend myself. This time, to make them see that staying silent makes them complicit, that looking away is choosing the side of the abuser." Tobenna smiled, a rare, full smile. "Then we'll speak, together if you want, or I'll stand beside you while you speak alone. Whatever you need." The village gathering happened monthly, usually just for boring administrative matters. But when Tobenna requested time to speak, the chief allowed it, partly out of respect, partly out of lingering guilt. Amara stood before the village again, but this time she wasn't a broken girl begging for help. She was a married woman, standing tall, her voice steady. "A year ago, I stood here showing you my scars," she began. "Today, I stand here showing you my healing. Not just my body, though those scars have faded, but my spirit, my hope, my belief that life can be good." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not here to shame you again. I'm here to ask you to do better, because I wasn't the only one suffering in this village. I'm not the only one still suffering. Look around you. Really look at the child who's too quiet, at the woman who always has new bruises, at the boy who flinches when voices raise. They're here. They're crying for help silently, the way I did." She locked eyes with people in the crowd. "When you hear screams, don't close your windows. When you see bruises, don't accept easy lies. When someone is being hurt, be the person I needed. Be Tobenna, someone who refuses to look away." An older man stood up, defensive. "You expect us to interfere in every family's business? To insert ourselves where we're not wanted? I expect you to remember that cruelty hidden behind closed doors is still cruelty," Amara said firmly. "That family matters is what abusers say to keep their victims trapped. That silence protects the wrong people." She softened slightly. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's necessary. And I'm saying I'll help. If anyone in this village is suffering abuse, my door is open. Tobenna's door is open. We won't judge. We won't turn you away. We'll help you find safety, the way he helped me find safety." Mama and Ketchy stood up, tears in her eyes. "You're right, child. We should have helped you sooner. I should have helped you. I won't make that mistake again. My door is also open." Slowly, others stood. Not everyone. Some remained seated, uncomfortable or unconvinced. But enough. Enough to matter. The chief cleared his throat. Perhaps we need a formal process. A way for people to report abuse safely. And a way to protect those who do. It was the beginning. Small, imperfect, but a beginning. 2 years after Amara's escape, she stood in her expanded garden, pregnant with her first child, a daughter they'd already decided to name Oluchi, God's work, because her existence felt like a miracle after years when Amara had thought she'd never survive to see this kind of joy. Tobenna came walking from the fields, saw her, and smiled his quiet smile. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like my body is not my own," she joked, "but in the best way, not controlled by someone else, but sharing it with someone I already love even though I haven't met her yet." She paused, her hand on her belly. "I was so scared I'd be like her, like Mrs. Okonkwo. That abuse would teach me to abuse. That pain would teach me to inflict pain. But you're not," Tobenna said softly. You learned the opposite lesson. You learned what not to do. You learned empathy, not cruelty. That evening, they sat outside as the sun set, and Amara reflected aloud on the journey that had brought her here. I spent so long waiting for someone to save me, she said, waiting for a neighbor to intervene, for the chief to notice, for some hero to appear. But no hero came, or rather, she looked at Tobenna. The hero who came didn't save me. He just kept the door open and let me save myself. You're the hero of your own story, Tobenna said. I was just a witness who refused to look away, and a friend who refused to stay silent. That's more than anyone else did, Amara reminded him. Never underestimate the power of being the one person who acts when everyone else freezes. 3 months later, Oluchi was born, healthy, perfect, and so loved it seemed to radiate from her like light. When Amara held her daughter for the first time, she made a promise whispered against the baby's soft head. You will never know the fear I knew. You will never doubt that you are precious. You will never wonder someone will protect you. Because I will. Always. This is where the cycle breaks. With you. With us. 5 years after Amara's escape, she ran a small school under a tree on their property. She taught reading and writing to village children whose families couldn't afford formal schooling. She taught girls especially, believing that education was a form of freedom. Her relationship with Mrs. Okonkwo remained non-existent. The woman had never apologized, never acknowledged her wrongs. She'd actually become more bitter as her circumstances declined. Without Amara's free labor, and with her biological children proving lazy and entitled, the household struggled. The wealth she'd stolen from Amara's father gradually dwindled through mismanagement and waste. Some people said Amara should feel vindicated by Mrs. Okonkwo's decline. But Amara felt only sadness for what could have been if the woman had chosen differently. I don't celebrate her suffering, Amara told Mama Nkechi once. I just celebrate my freedom from it. There's a difference. On the 5th anniversary of her escape, Amara and Tobenna stood together at the same baobab tree where they'd married. Their daughter played nearby, chasing butterflies and laughing. Sounds of joy that echoed across the land Amara had once crossed in desperate flight. Do you ever regret it? Tobenna asked. Leaving? Marrying me? This life? Never. Amara said without hesitation. Do you regret offering? Never, he echoed. Then more softly. Though I did wonder in the beginning if you'd ever stop being afraid of me. I was never afraid of you, Amara corrected gently. I was afraid of trusting anyone, of letting someone close enough to hurt me again. But you were patient. You proved with actions, not just words, that you meant what you promised. You taught me that not all men are dangerous, that strength can be gentle, that power can protect instead of dominate. She leaned against him, comfortable in a way that had taken years to build, but now felt as natural as breathing. You taught me what love could look like when it's chosen freely, not demanded or taken by force. When it's built on respect and partnership. When it's quiet and steady instead of loud and consuming. Tobenna wrapped his arm around her, and they watched their daughter play. Watched the sun set over fields they'd worked together. Watched the life they'd built from the ruins of pain and the seeds of hope. I used to think, Amara said quietly, that my story was about being saved, about a farmer who took me away from abuse. But that's not quite right. No, Tobenna asked. No, my story is about a girl who saved herself by choosing freedom, about a man who understood that sometimes love is about grand gestures. It's about keeping a door open and a promise kept. It's about a community that learned too slowly but not too late that silence in the face of evil is a choice, and that we're all responsible for the world we create by our actions or our inactions. She thought of the women she'd helped since then, the 2 girls who'd appeared at her gate with bruises and terror in their eyes, who she'd sheltered until safe arrangements could be made, the mothers who'd come to her quietly, asking how to leave, how to start over, how to find courage. She thought of the village that had slowly, imperfectly begun to change, where people now sometimes intervened when they heard screams, where the chief had established a council to investigate abuse claims, where Mrs. Okonkwo's treatment of her had become a cautionary tale about what happened when cruelty went unchecked. I don't have a perfect ending to my story, Amara said. Mrs. Okonkwo never apologized. Some people in the village still think I should have been more obedient, and I still have nightmares sometimes about those years. She turned to look at Tobenna directly, but I have a good ending, a true ending, an ending where I'm free and safe and loved, where my daughter will grow up knowing she's valued, where I can help others find their own doors to walk through. That's better than perfect, Tobenna said. That's real. As darkness fell and they called Oluchi inside for dinner, Amara thought about all the versions of herself she'd been. The beaten girl, the desperate fugitive, the uncertain bride, the healing woman, the confident mother, the community advocate. She thought about the day she'd stood at Tobenna's door, terrified and broken, and he'd simply said, "You don't have to go back there." Those simple words had changed everything, not because they'd saved her, but because they reminded her she could save herself, and that sometimes salvation looks like a quiet farmer of few words who simply refuses to look away when everyone else does, who watches, who witnesses, who acts, who keeps his promises, and who understands that the greatest love sometimes isn't passionate or dramatic. It's steady and quiet and present, day after day, year after year, building safety and respect and partnership brick by patient brick. That night, after tucking Oluchi into bed, Amara wrote in the journal she kept for 5 years. I spent years in a prison of fear. I escaped to find freedom. But what I learned is that freedom isn't just the absence of abuse. It's the presence of choice, the ability to say yes or no, the power to build your own life, the courage to speak your truth, the strength to help others find their own doors. My story isn't special. It's the story of too many women, too many children, trapped in situations where help seems impossible and escape seems hopeless. But if my story teaches anything, let it teach this. There's always a door. Sometimes you have to build it yourself. Sometimes someone keeps it open for you, but you are the one who has to walk through it. You are the hero of your own story. Be brave enough to save yourself. And then, if you can, be brave enough to keep your own door open for the next person who needs it. Because in the end, we're all just trying to survive. And we do it better when we refuse to suffer or to let others suffer in silence. She closed the journal and went to bed beside the man who'd taught her that words were optional but actions were everything. That promises kept were more valuable than promises made. That strength could be gentle and power could heal. And as she drifted asleep, safe and warm and free, she thought, this is what it feels like to be saved. Not by someone else, but by yourself, with help from someone who understood that true rescue is just keeping a door open and letting you walk through it, on your own feet, in your own time, toward your own freedom. Asterisk, what a powerful journey from suffering to freedom to helping others. Amara didn't just escape. She transformed her pain into purpose and started helping other abuse survivors. That's the definition of breaking the cycle. What lesson from this story hit you the hardest? Was it the community's silence? Tobenna's quiet courage? Amara's choice to save herself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something about courage and compassion, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to African Tales by Zion with notifications on for more powerful stories that combine entertainment with real-life wisdom. Remember, if you see someone suffering, don't look away. Don't close your windows. Be the person who keeps a door open. Be the Tobenna in someone's story. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next powerful tale, asterisk,